Well, thank you everybody for joining today's webinar. We do appreciate you taking your time to join us and listen to our stories and reflect on some of the changes in the market we're going through at the moment. Today's session is focusing on PAM without passwords, privileged access management. A controversial topic for many of you. Today we'll be exploring running your production infrastructure and activating PAM without passwords and how it can protect your business from itself and from regulators. My name is David Dingwall. I'm a cybersecurity strategist at Help Systems, and I talk to our customers and prospects about how tools and technology help and change the way they run their production operations in the real world. Today's agenda, I'm going to follow up on a series of webinars we've held over the last 24 months since the summer of 2018 to today. This is the final seminar in this series. We have talked about ongoing issues with system access and password use. We've also talked about the #1 cybersecurity priority project that the majority of our customers and prospects are proceeding with this year, multi-factor authentication. We'll pick up on what seems like the never-ending compliance challenge for your IT or your DevOps teams, and what this currently will mean for you, and more specifically for your partners in the same vertical elsewhere. Next, we're going to reflect on how PAM solutions need to adapt to a highly scalable and ever-changing infrastructures, especially cloud deployment. I'm going to finish up talking about a view looking at the next few years. Over the next 5 years, a typical asset renewal cycle, and the way our support teams operate and change, and how that's going to require new features from MFA, especially with using PAM solutions going forward. In 1962, Dr. Fernando Corbado created the concept of the user account and its associated password. This was all in parallel with the creation of what used to be called multi-user computing, turning computing equipment from very large calculators into something that could be shared with multiple people concurrently. He started with the operating system CTSS at MIT. This morphed later into a very secure operating system called Multics. Multics was later adopted by the Honeywell Corporation. Multics had a reputation for being very secure and quite difficult to implement. As a result, in the early 1960s, a tiny team at AT&T used the same user ID and password concept in a very cut-down operating system called Unix with a very basic security model. And quite frankly, that's created the market that we're in now for PAM solutions for Unix, Linux, and Windows. Basically, all that infrastructure we are running our production businesses on. Sadly, Professor Corbado died last week, before which he did have some interesting things to say about the ongoing sustainability of passwords in modern IT. Other luminaries in our space 15 years ago in the computing industry, including Bill Gates, were talking quite strongly about the death, and they used the word extinction of passwords. Bill Gates said that passwords no longer met the challenge of keeping critical information secure, and that he was determined to do something about it. Quite ironically, at the time, those of us who were looking after production systems, especially in North America, were very busy scrabbling around Excel spreadsheets and looking at systems, implementing the first compliance regimes that came out of Sarbanes-Oxley. Mainly looking at financial systems initially, password vaults were used as a quick jump-off point to protect the passwords of privileged accounts and system accounts. These implementations started as departmental projects for the finance team or the finance team's IT department. Implementations were pretty quick. Since then, password vaults have grown into a major industry. Application to application logins and sessions were protected using password vaults, inserting the passwords for each account into the session almost transparently. And as a result, password vaults have grown into strategic solutions used by major multinational corporations. Although it must be said now that password vaults are having difficulty keeping pace with the compliance requirement changes that are coming to the market today. I started in sales in the cybersecurity market, very much talking about PAM as an issue, building business applications, commercial applications on top of the Unix operating system in the early 1980s. My reference point was the US Department of Defense's Orange Book, and we were throwing buzzwords around like C2 and B1 security, and everybody in our space understood what we were talking about. As things got a little less esoteric into the 1990s, some major scandals required some major changes in the way all businesses operated. There were some scandals in the health sector in North America, and that generated the first HIPAA regulations in 1996. The Enron scandal kicked off what became known as Sarbanes-Oxley in the very early 2000s, and some fraud and some avoidable hacking in the card processing business, mainly associated with retailers, in 2004 kicked off the first ever edition of the PCI DSS standard version 1, making configuration recommendations and, again, like SOX, trying to do self-assessments and filling in lots of spreadsheets to show evidence to your auditors that you were meeting basic compliance requirements. Of course, since then, there have been some major steps around critical national infrastructure. Some regulations have been updated quite to extreme amounts over the last few years. There's been major milestones with PCI DSS 3.2 in 2018. GDPR has really kicked in through organizations who have EU citizens in their systems. And in North America, the impact of CCPA, the California Consumer Protection Act, is going to go live on the 1st of January next year. And that's going to impact most business operations for North American companies for their Californian consumers, certainly. 2019 has been what I would call a signature year. We're only just into July, and so 6 months, just over 6 months of activity has been going on, and there's been a lot of activity from some of our most trusted infosecurity and identity verification services. They've declared that passwords are unsafe and, looking forward, inherently unsustainable as a way to authenticate yourself with web applications and for your IT and support staff logging into systems and doing maintenance. Of course, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, IBM and AWS, they all offer federated login solutions, many of them with multi-factor authentication, configurable as an easy-to-use option. We are all very, very familiar with the Facebook login button, spread across tens of thousands of websites. You trust your Facebook login, and you use that to log into the site where you can buy art or look at videos. And very recently, Apple announced the Login with Apple service, which is almost identical in concept to the Facebook login button. That's going to be offered to organizations and websites to use over the next few months. All of them are driving the removal of locally hosted accounts, and especially account password storage on your production systems, taking that away. I'd like to point out Microsoft, more on their consumer side initially. They're driving both their consumers and business customers to make a major change and to swap over to strong authentication. They take quite a strident tone. I installed the Microsoft Windows Spring update last Friday, and the install took, as usual for the big ones, quite a few hours, and at the end it started suggesting that I swap over and change the way I log into my laptop and to my desktop PC and to the server I have in the corner of my office. What's interesting is they have already said that next spring's major release is going to change that default behavior and require you to use some kind of multi-factor authentication to log into Windows servers. But that could be using the Microsoft Hello service, voice identification, fingerprint IDs, or some other method of MFA. So it's a major change from an experience that we all use all the time, and Microsoft are determined to kill off the password. Coming back to the compliance timeline for a moment, it's worth being more explicit about which of the more modern compliance regimes are mandating MFA. So PCI DSS 3.2 has banned password access and requires MFA. The SWIFT changes I'll talk about in the next slide, and the same with the New York Department of Financial Services. They're all mandating MFA as a minimum requirement and a mandatory audit requirement. It's interesting that the more data protection and data assurance regulations, GDPR and CCPA, they have some interesting language talking about the state of the art, making sure that you're using and keeping up with technology. At the moment, the hot strong authentication technology is MFA. If you had a breach and you weren't using the latest technology, the something that was regarded as the most secure at the moment, if you have a breach, then you could be targeted and say, well, why did you not take that next step? So although it's not actually written into the regulations, slotting in what is currently state of the art is expected, and if the state of the art changes, then it's expected that you must keep up. Let's look at 3 regulatory environments that have gone through quite recent change, and 2 of which are going to go live on the 1st of January next year. PCI 3.2 was defined in 2018 and had a ramp-up period to become live in 2019. So it now mandates that you must log into systems and applications for maintenance and support using multi-factor authentication. No quibbling. Password access is completely banned. That's interesting because many card service providers are providing these services to retailers across the country and across the world on shared facilities. And there's some explicit requirements about making sure there's no shared accounts between customers, making sure that everybody's isolated, and to set an expectation that updates are going to come on at least an annual basis and will become significantly more stringent over time. SWIFT, you may have heard of vaguely in passing. It's the international money-moving infrastructure shared by the major banks, central banks, and other major financial houses across the world. It's a member organization, so it's not really a regulator, it's a commercial entity. But there's been significant scandals with tens of millions of dollars, yen, and euros disappearing from the SWIFT network in major frauds across country boundaries. And something had to be done quite seriously. It's taken them a couple of years, but the new first edition of their regulation is going live on the 1st of January 2020. Very much like the early days of PCI, the first iteration is filling in spreadsheets and declaring your own organization and their status. So December 31st is a self-certification stage. You have to send your results for each and every installation you have. So there's 18,000 members. That does mean with multiple sites and offices, there's somewhere in the region of more than 30,000 SWIFT installations worldwide. Each installation needs to be certified and verified. SWIFT has said that if an organization's particular installation is boldly non-compliant, then they would reserve the right to withdraw all SWIFT services from that installation. Quite a major threat if you're a financial company moving money across countries. Your business could stop almost instantly. For those organizations who don't quite make it to the line, they have until the end of June 2020 to completely be certified and fill in all their gaps and be completely remediated. It's really important to get to a fixed point because the expectation is very much like the the consulting and training ecosystem that's happened around PCI over the last 15 years, it's expected that audits of the SWIFT infrastructure in the future is going to be completely third-party, external people coming in to look at your infrastructure and certifying it or failing it based on the current criteria. It's also expected that the SWIFT compliance requirements are going to be severely upgraded over the next few years. And then lastly, a really interesting one is the New York State Department of Financial Services. They've taken what is best practice from tier 1 banks and financial institutions that are registered in their state in Wall Street, and they've created a baseline of minimum requirements, and they've expanded the profile of who needs to apply and make sure these operational settings are actually operated and audited and reported on. So if you think about the North American financial services market, if you're a bank, you do have a branch in New York, therefore you have to register with the New York Department of Financial Services. Therefore, regardless of where in the country you are, all of your systems are subject to this regulation. So that's 1,400 US banks, 1,800 insurance companies, and 75,000 financial related organizations, everyone from your bail bondsman to someone who's trying to sell you insurance plans to help finance a film in Hollywood, somebody who's trying to sell you a plan for you to buy your next automobile. All of these organizations in some way or other are subject to these regulations. There are size exclusions, financial exclusions. If an organization does not turn over more than 10 million US dollars in the state of New York, then they don't have to do anything. However, if you look at even tiny organizations, they do push a lot of money through the system. So somewhere in the region of probably 35,000 organizations in the US are going to have to do something to become somewhat compliant to these regulations. And again, these go live on the 1st of January 2020. Quite a major gulp. Now you might think, okay, I'm not in financial services, I'm fine, this is not going to hit me, then I'm going to suggest you need to think again. Critical national infrastructure, the analysis of which verticals and industries in the US economy are absolutely critical to sustaining the state and the public good, has devolved into 16 pillars, 16 verticals that are absolutely critical that you can see on this slide. Now, of course, each of these verticals many have their own regulators. Some have no common regulators at all. Manufacturing covers lots of different manufacturing sectors, and there's no one common regulator. That's going to have to change in some areas. For some markets like telecoms and water and waste utilities, that's somewhat easier to have a regulator. Energy production and nuclear power plants, they do have their own regulators. And of course, New York has picked up the baton for financial services, so that's already covered. But the expectation is more work is going to come and more regulatory compliance requirements, more expectations about what you actually have to set up and what you might need to change soon is coming down the road very soon. Interestingly, for the organization who set up this framework, they've also been working on technical settings and recommendations, one of which is the NIST Foundation Core 1.1. It was built and released in draft in early 2018 and was brought live on April 2018. It was initially sent out for comment to the general market, and there was a significant amount of input from large organizations, some of those companies who provide federated login services under the umbrella of what's called the FIDO Alliance. And they all indicated that multi-factor authentication must be part of the core. The code is interesting. They're suggesting any privileged action on a network application, process, or system must be authenticated by MFA. And then there was significant input about why password authentication was completely insecure And then they reflected off against some NIST standards why OTP authentication also was insecure because NIST had already said so. NIST pushed back a little in 2018 and kind of indicated that many verticals weren't ready for MFA and that some MFA technology was a little bit immature. 2 years later, things have changed quite dramatically. Of course, New York has picked up the baton for financial services, and they have issued their revision of the regulations for the financial services market for North America and mandating MFA. Some others are due to report over the next 6 months. And then lastly, the NIST Foundation Core itself is also due for renegotiation. And the expectation based on the strong feedback from the last time is MFA is definitely going to be part of the authentication solution mix going forward. Keep in mind that even if your organization is only providing products or services or is buying products or services from these verticals, you also could be part of or seen as the web of the critical national infrastructure. This happened with Sarbanes-Oxley. It was initially focused at financial services and the state of financial accounts. The web of responsibility and the way auditors looked at things started spreading sideways pretty quickly. We expect the same thing to apply to each of these 16 pillars and the associated companies that provide services to them. Let's move over and talk a little bit about preparation. There are other ways of authenticating in through infrastructures using strong authentication, and one of those is using SSH, the secure shell. SSH has been around for a couple of decades now and went through a major revision in the early 2000s. The keys that are used to secure the communications between two different systems or between applications, they need to be available on both physical machines for the SSH environment to actually work. And the management and the creation of the keys has really been on an ad hoc basis. In the past, it was actually created on the server. It could be created by an individual who had authority or a contractor or a supplier. More commonly these days, someone from your IT or DevOps support team would have the ability to create SSH keys. But also software package installations can create SSH keys because they're needed for strong communication between one software package and another. And lastly, in the cloud world that we are all living in now, if you are spinning up, say, 50 copies of a well-trusted virtual machine image, when those copies are fired up 50 times, then you would have 50 unique SSH system keys created at the same time as part of the tooling process. So it's something that doesn't need a manual intervention at all. AWS, as example, has this available as a checkbox item in the virtual machine creation step. Sadly, unfortunately, with all these potential ways to create keys, there's no real common author of keys in many IT infrastructures still. And you end up with what I call shotgunning of SSH public keys all over your production infrastructure. A key is created on one system that holds the private key. The public key version needs to be distributed to all the systems it may need to talk to. And that process can be rather vague or not very well defined, or the keys could be over distributed to systems that will never ever use them. Very often these transfers of keys are done in bulk or semi-bulk methods, basically using shell scripts and basic file transfer mechanisms, not particularly secure and not very trackable in many cases, not tied into event management systems. And as a result, very often these scripts can fail in undependable ways. So you can't actually be sure that the key you need to use is actually on the system it needs to be on. The whole key distribution mechanism becomes a logarithmic problem and becomes a production support nightmare. Key discovery tools for SSH keys has become a whole business all of its own. And they try and identify what's out there, but they have a very poor record of actually trying to work out the context of a particular SSH key sitting in a particular directory on a particular system, and doesn't really answer the question about what happens if one of my administrators deletes the key. Will something break? The discovery tools don't really help you with that at all. If someone takes the key away and they don't understand the IT applications or the business processes running, it's very easy to impact your production process very, very simply. And a key production process could be killed and not operate the way you expect. As a result, IT staff have got into the habit of not deleting SSH keys at all. There has been some improvement over time over the last decade or so. Change management tools like Puppet, Ansible, or Chef, it makes it easy for the key creation step to be captured as a change event at the start. What that does is captures who's responsible for creating the key or the task it's associated with. That is, by definition, a good thing. The transfer mechanism for moving keys around is still transferring a text file, in effect. And what we're seeing, even with these configuration management systems, is the timelines to get keys onto various production systems can be very variable. Some keys may not make it for at least 30 minutes from the time the change event is created. Some keys may not make it into a production system for over a day or never, because there's no escalation process with the change event. It just sits in a queue. If the queue gets stuck, the keys get stuck. And again, the impact on your production processes that depend on these keys being around becomes very, very fragile. Now, we've been talking about privileged access management and a certain amount about compliance. The compliance regimes and the authorities are starting to have significant phase about the credentials that are used, especially for strong authentication. In the past, we'll all have seen policies around life cycles for passwords and password expiration. A password needs to be complex with particular patterns allowed and particular words banned. The same kind of framework is starting to surround compliance requirements for SSH keys. By default, because keys were created by hand initially, system keys are typically created with 10-year lifespans by default. That definitely may not fit in your vertical with the regulatory compliance framework you have to live with. A key renewal, being able to delete a key and replace it without integrating into your change management lifecycle processes, can also be a problem. And of course, in an ideal world, the new keys that you create need to be registered in some kind of central authority. And you need to be sure that all keys are completely expunged from your production system. You will see auditors working, looking for expired user accounts with expired passwords sitting in your production environment and seeing that as a compliance failure. Same thing is going to happen with expired or unused SSH keys. The existence of those in files and production infrastructure, even if they're not being used, will be seen as a failed compliance event going forward. The automation around key renewal process is a bit tricky. It's not, again, not particularly stable and needs to be toughened up and made easier to handle. As a result, PAM vendors like OutSystems have taken it on themselves to bring copies of the SSH keys into their security database as part of a registration process. This has a whole series of positive impacts. It allows you to put some context around a key as it's created. It allows you to track the key and work out when it needs to be replaced. When the key is replaced, then it only needs to happen as one step, and how that key gets distributed or not distributed thereafter is another kind of problem for elsewhere. It does make it significantly easier for you to track SSH keys and use them for what they're really good for, application to application and system to system communications. Let's take a slightly different perspective. Let's face it, our infrastructure decision-making processes are speeding up all the time. And how we staff Our infrastructures has morphed more from static stovepipes of skills into DevOps type role-based, multiple role-based operations with people being multi-skilled in multiple parts of the infrastructure at the same time. And let's face it, our business processes are changing exceedingly fast. So building a security policy that works this week may not be appropriate in 6 months' time. So you need to have an environment that can change and flex over time and changes to be applied to the security policy automatically as approved change events. As a result, PAM tools themselves are having to take a subordinate role. And identity governance, role-based management, and especially some of the role tracking and what they call entitlement management, picking up some terminology from human resources, are becoming much more important to clearly define what a particular role can carry out in your production infrastructure and to be crystal clear about its audit and compliance status. As a result, PAM solutions need to be auto-deployable as part of system builds. They need to pre-connect to your operating systems almost invisibly. And certainly you need to make sure there's no need for local configuration on each and every instance where it's installed. It needs to integrate seamlessly with all the major public and private cloud infrastructures. If you have a standalone PAM solution protecting, say, your AWS cloud, and next week you have a new CIO, CTO, or CISO who tells you next year at this time we're going to be on Google Cloud for all our production workloads, having to scrabble to find and build a new PAM solution and make sure security policy still works is a project that nobody really wants to pick up as an emergency task. So having a PAM solution that is multi-platform and can flex as you move your infrastructure around between different types of clouds becomes hugely important. The last one is more a sourcing question. And this is around the use of multi-factor authentication as a technology set. There are only probably 5 or 6 serious players in the whole world who provide MFA with tokens. And their product life cycles have changed, and they've also been targeted with service interruptions as well. In the past, we have operated 2-factor authentication, and there's maybe 20 to 30 vendors, serious vendors across the world, issuing smart cards and USB tokens to your IT support teams, but may have numbered in the tens or hundreds or maybe the low thousands across a corporate infrastructure. Multi-factor authentication from a scale perspective is very different. MFA is also being used for application access and website access and everything else. And if you find there's issues with the tokens, then the impact on your business operations is significantly more serious. Here are 3 examples. Cybersecurity analysts spend a lot of time focusing on these 5 or 6 MFA vendors, looking at weaknesses in their implementations. And there have been 3 big ones in the last, well, even in the last 12 calendar months. The first one was the commercial implementation of YubiKey. It had an API weakness, and as a result, a fair percentage of the YubiKey commercial distribution across the world to all their customers had to be replaced and updated. Quite a significant impact to their commercial reputation. This calendar year, the Google Tiger identification token, it had a different kind of weakness for those tokens that were defined to be Bluetooth enabled. The Bluetooth implementation itself was found to be weak and had a major hole in it. And as a result, Google's publicity machine, which had been pushing the Tiger token for about 6 months, all of a sudden went very, very silent. And Google started talking about its federated login solution instead. MFA all of a sudden was a conversation that wasn't happening out in the general market. And they're still having trouble replacing all these Bluetooth tokens to the customers they've deployed them to. YubiKey, sadly, has also been hit again This time in the government space, the FIPS compliant YubiKey token had a problem with its random number generators. It wasn't as random as it should have been. And as a result, every FIPS compliant YubiKey token had to be replaced. Our takeaway for MFA specifically is rather a strange one. MFA is a great technology, but you have to consider at least a dual sourcing model for your organization, just like how we used to source IT systems for more than one manufacturer. And therefore, your PAM solution has to support multiple different MFA providers in parallel and in concert. In case a manufacturer can't replace keys in the event that there's a significant weakness, or if your business processes are just so critical during this extended key replacement cycle that you just have to jump to another vendor. So coming to the close part of this presentation, let's focus on the help systems, PAM solutions, and how we operate with strong authentication. We can really recommend that it is now possible to operate an IT infrastructure without passwords at all. This is very much in line with the recommendations from Microsoft and others. We've been using MFA for user authentication and SSH keys for system-to-system and application-to-application authentication. And we have the ability with security policy to completely ban password authentication in your whole infrastructure with a click of a button. And so you can remove that as a business risk, someone jumping into your system and hacking into one machine and then starting to do a password hack. If there are no passwords to hack, then it significantly improves your security posture. We've got customers who've been operating this way for up to 15 years. So this is very much production ready. Their infrastructures have up to tens of thousands of servers and workstations, and their planned cloud deployments is going to jump that to hundreds of thousands over the next 2 years. So we are not scared about scalability of this type of PAM solution with strong authentication across big geographies. It's something that we don't really have a concern with at all. Our PAM solution can integrate SSH host and user key registration at a central point, and we can completely ignore any laying around manually generated keys and make them completely irrelevant from a security policy perspective. As you can imagine, it also makes SSH Key Renewal very, very simple. A central repository with context makes key updates a simple task to track and follow. In addition, with our solution, you can choose to distribute or not to distribute SSH keys out to physical servers. You can flick a policy switch and have the application or system account or user account look in real time over the network into our policy database for the key they must be using right now or the corresponding key they're trying to connect to on another system. It significantly reduces the need for distribution and clawback of keys that have expired over time. Now, I'm not going to say that the use of passwords is absolutely completely gone, because there is one tiny minority case where password use is unfortunately still essential. And that is the very small case where a production system falls off the network. It may still be running with an application running by itself and nothing to talk to. More honestly, with the kind of cloud application models and clusters we've been building these days, it's more liable to fall over. It may need someone to physically log into the hardware, log in with some kind of privileged user ID and password. And in that case, the breakpass functionality of a password vault is actually excellent to solve that one problem. Checking out the current randomized password for the root account or the admin account on that particular machine, logging in and allowing the administrator to do their work to get the system back connected to the network and back into the security domain. Our recommendations in this kind of infrastructure is if you're using password access more than 0.5 to 1% of all authentications, then we would suggest there's something still significantly wrong with your authentication policy, and you need to make some changes to become compliant. So today we've just been walking very quickly through some ancient history, why we are where we are with user IDs and passwords. We've all had to live with compliance changes over the last 3 decades, but the mandate to move away from passwords is coming very quickly. To steal a quote from the film Contact, passwords are not completely gone, but you've been handed your hat and your coat and you're being guided towards the door out of the room. You may realize or you may understand your industry or your business partners in regulated industries may be more exposed and more regulation is coming. You need to plan for it. SSH use is very prevalent in Linux and Unix infrastructures, but the way it's deployed and the way it is managed day to day can be rather ad hoc. That has to be fixed. It needs to be brought into the lifecycle discussion. And then we talked a bit about asset planning and sourcing of MFA solutions and how to protect yourself. As you can imagine, we have a much wider story that we'd love to share with you if you're interested. And of course, we're very happy to talk to you. Please contact us through these links. Talk to us on the website. We do have some links on Facebook and other social media platforms as well. We're very happy to talk to you about how our PAM solutions operate and how we can get you into a completely different world that is completely compliant but kills the use of passwords in your commercial life completely and keep the business operating at the same time. Well, thank you very much for spending time listening to me, going on for 40 minutes. I hope today has been useful, and I hope to hear from some of you if you have further questions or you'd like to explore these solutions and operational issues further. Thank you very much, and I hope to be talking to you again soon. Goodbye.